Good morning, and thank you for joining us. For the past 4 years, we have celebrated Early Ed Week, but today we kick off the first annual Louisiana Early Ed Month. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Libby Saunier, and I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children. I'm honored to welcome all of you today to our keynote address this morning. I'm also honored to recognize the title sponsor for the Louisiana Early Ed Month 2022, Entergy. This event would not be possible without their generous support that we have received from Entergy and all our supportive sponsors and donors. To kick us off, we have a message from Governor John Bel Edwards, a leader who understands that education is the key to economic opportunity and that the pathway to prosperity must begin at the earliest stages of life. Thank you, Governor Edwards, for proclaiming February 2022 as Early Ed Month.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to join you in kicking off Louisiana's first Early Education Month. In fact, I've been pleased to sign this proclamation, dated the 1st of February, so that throughout the month of February we can celebrate together Early Education Month. You know, despite the difficult challenges facing our state, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and recovery from devastating hurricanes, we've learned how important early care and education are for our students, their families, and our economy. Last year, 60% of our kindergarten students did not meet critical benchmarks at their start of school. And studies show that our economy loses $1.3 billion every year due to breakdowns within our child care system. We can do better. We must do better. By working together, we can help ensure that every child has access to quality early care and education, which will set them on the path to success and develop a reliable workforce to grow our businesses and our economy. It's a win-win for everyone. Thank you for your continued partnership. Enjoy the event, and God bless.
Now we're excited for our keynote address this morning. As you enjoyed today's address and the rest of this month's activities, we invite you to share your participation on social media using the hashtag #LAEarlyEdMonth. At this time, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Cade Brumley, the Louisiana State Superintendent of Education, who will kick us off today for today's events and introduce our esteemed keynote speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Saunier. I appreciate being here with you and everyone else today. In the past, we've celebrated Early Ed Day. In the past, we've celebrated Early Ed Week. But I'm excited to be part of the inaugural Early Ed Month in the state of Louisiana. That's exciting. I think it brings further attention and illumination to this key area in our communities, the industry, as well as the need to prepare students as much as possible so that they'll be ready for kindergarten. We have to make sure that every child in our state has access to high quality early care and education. That means we need quantity of seats for every family, as well as making sure that those seats are high quality seats for every single child. We believe that we're on the pathway to doing that, and we believe that collaboration is key to achieve that goal. So for instance, we need policymakers, we need our business community, we need philanthropy, we need our early care and education providers, our families, and even our smallest learners, our youngest learners in the state to be engaged in this process together. We're doing this, we're doing it together, and we will continue to get better because our future depends on it. We've been successful. I anticipate we'll continue to see great success in this particular area. As you know from me, I've stated many times that early care and education, early childhood education, is the greatest educational challenge we face as a generation. So this morning, I'm excited to welcome our keynote speaker. It's a pleasure to announce Dr. Junlei Li, who is our keynote speaker. He is the co-chair of Human Development and Education at Harvard University, as well as senior lecturer. He invests a lot of his time in thinking about and in talking with, better understanding, and helping set policy and practice for those who care for our youngest learners in our communities. So at this time, it's an honor to welcome Dr. Junlei Li to the program.
Thank you, Dr. Bromley, and thank you especially for your leadership and support for early childhood education in the state of Louisiana. And it's a pleasure for me to join all of you today to celebrate the inaugural Early Education Month for the state. And I wanted to talk, especially today, about what it would mean to invest in a good enough early childhood system. If we could have the slides, please. And by that, I mean that we want an early childhood system that is certainly good enough for our children, for our families, but at the same time also good enough for the people who work in the teachers, the caregivers, the providers themselves. And we want to start with this idea of investment. For at least the last 2 or 3 decades, we have been talking a lot about investment and why we need to invest. And as the governor was talking about earlier, that it is quite clear what the return on investment for all of us as a community, as a state, as a country, what it would be in terms of in terms of the resources we invest in the earliest years. But when we talk about investment in just this way, we're talking about investment in terms of the investment of financial resources or capital, right? Thinking about this kind of as economists would. But today I wanted to talk about a different kind of investment to see if it's possible to combine together these ideas of investment. So one of my role models in the early childhood work is someone that, depending on your age, you might be quite familiar with, Mr. Rogers. I went to graduate school in the city of Pittsburgh, and I had the honor of working in Fred Rogers' organizations after he had died. And Mr. Rogers used to say that anyone who has ever been able to sustain good work has had at least one person, often many, who have believed in them. And we don't just get to be competent human beings without a lot of different investments from others. And so thinking about investments in this context, we're not talking about just the investment of money, or we're not just talking about a financial return on that investment. We're talking about a different kind of investment, the kind of investment of people, of who they are in our own lives. All of you who are listening, I would imagine that there are children, or there are friends, and there are families and colleagues in your life for whom you have made that kind of investment. And I would certainly hope that for everyone who's listening, that you can feel other people who have made that kind of investment in you as you were growing up. And for today, I just wanted to take us into an infant toddler classroom. This was just a scene in an infant toddler classroom in the state of Georgia, where we had been working for a few years. And since we're celebrating early childhood, I thought what better way to celebrate than to just sit down in the infant toddler classroom and watch the children, watch the caregiver, and watch what this work is all about. Go ahead with the video.
Go. Go. You making bubbles? You making bubbles? Here, get your car.
Timmy's on the way.
Hey, you gonna play cards with us? You gonna play cards with us? Oh.
Take the bus. Take the bus and the cookie. There you go. Go take the bus and the cookie.
Here comes the bus. Kim's gonna play with us. You gonna play with us? There you go. There you go. High five. High 10. High 10. High 10. There you go. There you go. High 10. 10. High 10. 10.
There you
There you go. I got a double high 10. I'm sorry. I didn't go too quick. I'm sorry. Let him go. Let him go. You went back down? You come back up? Making music. You gonna dance to it? Oh. 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 You held yours longer than me. Oh, thank you. Oh. Oh. You got no more left? You got no more left? Hey, girl, what you doing, girl? What you doing, girl? Thank you, girl.
I hope it was all right to bring all of us into the infant toddler classroom. This was just an everyday moment that we often, observe and capture in early childhood. And the teacher here, her name was Miss Nikki. And I hope, as you think about these moments, right? So we can talk, about policies, we can talk about research, but there's something about these moments that intuitively makes sense to all of us. Certainly for any of the teachers and care providers who are from here, but even for those who don't work on the front lines of early childhood. There's something about us as human beings that we resonate with these connections, with these interactions that happens. And if we had the time, if this was this in-person event, I would have stopped and just asked all of you, like, when you watch that, what is it that you notice about the interactions that's going back and forth? And my bet is that as we go around the room, right, that some of you would have pointed out kind of the sense of connection that the teacher and the children seem to have, the way that they respond to each other, the way they are present to each other, they see each other, they hear each other. Some of you may have noticed the sense of engagement or reciprocity, or sometimes in early childhood we call a servant return, right? Whatever that's happening seemed to go back and forth, whether it was about the toy or whether it was about blowing bubbles or whether it is about saying, giving each other high fives. It's just going back and forth between the children and the teacher. And then some of you might have pointed out that there was really the sense of belonging, the sense of inclusion here, right? You can be older, you can be younger, you might need support to stand up, or you might not be talking yet, or you might be a little shy, or you might be a little forward, but it doesn't matter who you are, that this is a place for you, that you have a place here. And the provider, the teacher, the caregiver sees you and welcomes you and has time for you. And lastly, especially for those who have been in the education field, even in those brief 2-3 minutes, you see that there were opportunities to grow, opportunities to learn, right? And this opportunity to learn may be very different from one child to the other. For the baby, it may be just to learn what it means to interact with somebody, to be able to go back and forth. And for the older children, it might be to learn that, hey, I can bring a toy over here to help out and to engage the little baby. Or for someone else, it may be to learn that, I can balance myself or stretch both my hands really high to go from high 5 to high 10. It may be different for every child in every moment, but these opportunities are inside these interactions. And so when we look at a moment like this, we think about a different meaning of the word investment. This idea of devoting and using and giving time, giving talent, giving your emotional energy, or in short, give who you are as a person, to give yourself for a purpose for this child, right? And we can feel that if you're a frontline caregiver, a teacher, but any of us who have been with young children as parents, as grandparents, or even as neighbors, we know that in these moments, right, the kind of things we give is tied to who we are. And as one early childhood educator put it to me so long ago, that the day-to-day interactions, the everyday work of early childhood is about doing what is right now. And in the course of the work that my colleagues and I do, we have the opportunity to travel across the United States and around different parts of the world to focus on what Mr. Rogers always called the helpers, the people, the helping professionals, or sometimes they're volunteers, the professionals who are serving children and families all around the neighborhoods, all around each different community. They might be a family childcare provider in their little house. They might be an infant toddler caregiver in a center. They might be in the urban communities. They might be in the rural communities. They might be in a Head Start classroom. And no matter where they are, and no matter the settings in which they are working, they are there to bring about who they are in front of children day in and day out, even sometimes in conditions, in contexts that we can't quite imagine. For example, a while ago, we worked in my home country, China, in impoverished rural communities. And there you see that, just this one classroom of 4-year-olds, we have about 45 4-year-olds for just 2 teachers. And these ratios may seem enormous here in the United States, but this is what they could afford at that time. And the teachers still manage, right? They still find a way to be present and to offer these interactions. And during the pandemic, some of my colleagues were following the work of early intervention specialists for young children and their families who are learning to do early intervention on Zoom for the first time in their professional careers. And somehow they managed to figure out how to connect with the families, how to tell my left from your right, even as they're trying to demonstrate and support their families in supporting their children. And no matter what is the context, the helpers, the helping professionals always find a way to connect, to reciprocate, to create a sense of belonging, and to support the opportunities to grow for both young children as well as their families. And for any of you who are interested to think about this work, particularly from a professional context, we invite you to visit us and join us at our website, simpleinteractions.org. And we have made all of the resources and tools free and accessible in perpetuity for anyone who might find a way to use it in their context. But I wanted to talk today a little in particular about what we have all been experiencing during the last 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic, along with everything else that is happening around the world. Of course, over the last 2 years, many of us in the early childhood system are wondering what has changed about the work of early childhood, but also what remains the same, what remains unchanging. Of course, the biggest kind of practical change was that early on, so many preschools and childcare had to close or close intermittently because of COVID-19, because of staff who are infected or children who might be. But over this period, over time, childcare providers, preschools, and kindergartens all around the country try to stay open, keeping staff, keeping children safe, as well as to provide these developmental opportunities for children and to provide relief and support and partnership to families. I wanted to share another story with all of you. This story comes from our colleagues in New York City, where, as many of you remember, 2 years ago, COVID first hit. And this was a project called the High Quality Early Learning Project, and you can find their website through just a simple Google search. And it was a partnership between Dr. Beverly Falk, an early childhood professor at the City College of New York, and Meryl Feigenberg, who's a filmmaker. And what they have done over time is throughout New York City, they have gone out to visit schools, visit early childhood settings, and interview the helpers, interview the teachers to understand what high quality early learning looks like. So when the pandemic hit, they decided to do just the same. And in the City College of New York, there's a preschool right there on campus. That was established to provide childcare for the undergraduate students so that students can attend classes and schools knowing that their young children are well cared for. Now, as the pandemic hit New York City, the preschool had to shut down for a period of time. But very shortly afterwards, after sorting out kind of the health protocols, they were able to reopen. And when they reopened for the children of the first responders in New York, so that as they attend to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis in New York City at the time, they know that their children are in a safe place and they're cared for. And I just wanted to show you kind of what that scene looks like. For many of you who have kept preschools and childcare open, many of these interactions, the masks, and would seem kind of would remind you of the work that you do. But I just wanted to give us a chance to take a look at that scene, to think about kind of what obviously have changed during COVID about early childhood education, but perhaps more importantly, what remains constant, what remains the same about these interactions. We can go with the video.
Sleeping.
All the babies are sleeping.
It's sleeping. See, look it.
Oh, let me see.
See, look.
I'll be back soon.
Look it.
Let me see them sleeping.
Look.
Oh, they are sleeping.
Sleeping and chewing there.
Okay, so let them rest then, okay?
It's rested the rest of the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hey, what's that? It's grass. Is he saying?
Is sister back from school?
Grab some soap. Give her some.
Where's sister so we can give her some soap up? Let's give her some soap. You want to give her the soap or you or me?
You.
Okay.
No, what about the grandpa?
Okay, let's do the grandpa. The grandpa's gonna give her the soup. Does that make her feel better?
Yeah, because I want to go back to bed.
Okay.
I'm not feeling well.
She's still not feeling well. Hopefully with the soap actually feels better, right, Sophia?
No.
No? So what else can we do to make sister feel better?
Go for put it right here.
Okay.
Put it right
What's
here.
this? The kitchen?
Yes.
I think brother's waiting for sister to get back. Sisters, good morning.
Good morning.
Take up your stuff.
Alright, so
Other one inside
that's
there.
good? Alright, you ready to go? You want me to hold it or you hold it? Help me. Take it. Good job.
What is it?
Take your bin. Hold it right, please. Go to your seat. We're going to your seat. Come on. I'll sit with you. We're going to take you like this. Sit in your seat. I'm going to bring my chair, okay? Okay. What you want to do first? Okay. Put the plate over.
Look at it.
I think what touched me about those moments is that as unusual as it seems, as unusual as it is to have the masks, to have the children separated at different tables, we see at the same time what the best of early childhood provide. You see children who long for a sense of normalcy, that even as the world around them, and they can feel it in their families and so on, they wanted to play, right? And so you see a teacher matching kind of children's enthusiasm to play. But when a child wants to play out the drama that's inside, that reflects the outside, about people feeling sick, about people feeling unwell, and you see the same teacher just quiets down and gets into that moment with that child. And then you see a third child just walks in feeling tentative and unsure. We have no idea, right, what that child might have gone through that morning, what that child might be worrying about, and what that child's families may be worrying about, considering that they might be first responders who are themselves in hospitals struggling. And then you see the teacher kind of quietly walks along with him, right, to help him settle into the classroom. And all these are just these simple, ordinary, everyday moments that happen inside the classroom of teachers trying to provide a sense of normalcy, a sense of developmental opportunity for young children, even during a time where everything around us didn't feel normal, everything around us did not feel usual. And for all the frontline teachers and caregivers and center directors that are out there listening today, you have done that over the last 2 years, making every adjustment possible to create the early learning environment in this unusual time. I was talking about this with my colleague, Dr. Dana Winters, who's the executive director of the Fred Rogers Center out in Pittsburgh. And we were thinking, 2 years ago about what families, what teachers, what caregivers are going through. And she reminded me of something that Mr. Rogers used to say to parents, but we can extend that to educators as well. That parents and educators can set an example by just being themselves rather than trying to be the perfect parent or the perfect educator. And Mr. Rogers talked about there were times when he couldn't be with his own children and that he couldn't give them their undivided attention, but he realized that everything does not have to be perfect in order to be effective. And that has been our understanding as well. That everything doesn't have to be perfect to be helpful, and that the helpers all around the world have dealt with the imperfections of their environment, but nevertheless have been so helpful to the children and to the families that they support. I want to offer just a few ideas about what is the difference between thinking about something that is good enough and thinking about something that has to be perfect when it comes to early childhood. I think sometimes we have this idea that the perfect helper, whether we're thinking about a provider or a parent, the perfect helper to the children is someone who can give all of their attention and all of their time to the children or to the families that they're supporting, whenever that's needed. And over this pandemic, when you think about the teachers who are struggling, balancing the health protocols, the masks with the caregiving and teaching, when you think about families, right, who are struggling to work at home or trying to find work and juggling all the stresses and caring for their children, you understand that that image of perfection isn't the common experience. In fact, all of us struggle with divided attentions, with the different things that we have to juggle in order to support our children and families. In this context, it helps, I think, to think about that the good enough helper is someone who can show up fully and authentically to be present when they are able to be with the children and be with the families. And in these brief videos we were just showing, maybe it's just a few seconds long, maybe it's just a few minutes, but when they are able, these teachers, these caregivers show up as fully as they possibly can to receive what the children have to offer. On the second note, sometimes, particularly coming from the research community, sometimes there's this assumption that the perfect helper, the provider, the teacher, the parent, somehow needs to understand all of the latest educational strategies and research, whether it's research about the brain or the social emotional development, or whether it's strategies about literacy. Of course, learning about strategies and research can be helpful, but it is not possible that all of us would know all of these things, not even researchers. The good enough helper is someone who, more than anything else, understands their children or the family that they're supporting better, more than anyone else. That they are the ones, right, who can see a child or see the children, see the families as a whole, and they interact and they find ways to support the child and the families based on that understanding. And that understanding is ultimately foundational, no matter what educational strategy and research that we're trying to apply. And lastly, there's this perception that the perfect helper must be someone who can find and provide every conceivable resource and opportunity for the children. And over the last year, as families struggled to help their children getting on Zoom from a cell phone or a little Chromebook, right? As teachers struggle to reach out to families on the phone in text messaging, we know that we don't have access to all the resources. But in this context, it doesn't mean that we haven't been helpful, that the good enough helpers, they gradually discover that they themselves are the child's or the family's most important resource. That in all the stories that we have heard over the pandemic, right, it's the helpers who reached out. It's the helpers, even through shaky internet connections, bring their best effort to that screen, to that little camera, trying to reach out and connect, not just with the children, but with the children's families. And ultimately, it was the resourcefulness, not just the sheer amount of resources, but it was the resourcefulness of the helpers, the way that they made use of very limited resources, but they brought themselves through these resources to the children and families. It is they who mattered during this time. And how do we know all of this can actually be good enough for the children, for the families in our communities, in our neighborhoods? For many years, our field have talked about adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs, what they are called. And the simple idea is that as children experience a disproportionate amount of adverse childhood experiences, the negative outcomes are going to start to outweigh the potential positive outcomes, and they start to reshape the physiology of a child. And these adverse childhood experiences historically has been categorized in terms of essentially broken human relationships in the form of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. As researchers over time have understood that these are sometimes just the symptoms of the adverse experiences, like the fundamental inequities that are baked into our systems and baked into our history. But what has given me so much hope the last few years is to be able to look on the other side of this balance beam, to look at positive childhood experiences and to see what positive childhood experiences could do. For this, I refer to the work that is called, quite literally, HOPE, standing for Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences. This work is led by one of our colleagues, Dr. Robert Segi, at Tufts University School of Medicine, along with other colleagues across the country. And what they have identified in this public health research is that even as these adverse childhood experiences are happening, there are positive childhood experiences that are happening for many children and families at the same time. And these experiences come to positive relationships, safe environments, meaningful participatory engagement in the community, and support for children's emotional growth. Now, in these public health studies, how did they go about figuring that out, right? And just like in the adverse childhood experiences where they asked people, have you experienced this, right, as you were growing up? And every time you say yes, you get a score of 1, another 1, another 1, and the scores add up. They did the same thing for the positive childhood experiences. And here are the things they asked about people, about their growing up experiences. Do you feel safe and protected by an adult in your home? Right? Even if there were challenges in your home, but do you feel safe and protected by at least one adult in the home? Do you feel you're able to talk to some members of your family about your feelings, how you're feeling, whether you're happy or whether you're sad or mad? Do you feel that your family stood by you when you were struggling, whether you're struggling at school or whether you're struggling with yourself? Can you name at least 2 grown-ups, 2 adults outside your family who has taken a genuine interest in you? It might be a teacher, it might be a coach, it might be a mentor. Do you feel supported by friends in your community, in your neighborhood? Do you feel a sense of belonging in school, whatever school that you happen to be in? And do you find a meaning? Do you enjoy participating in community traditions that may have honored who you are, who your family are, and the cultures from which you came and to which you belong? And what the researchers have found is that every time you answer yes to one of these questions, the positive childhood experience scores add up in the same way that we used to see the scores add up for these adverse childhood experiences. And what happens when we add up to these experiences? Well, what we see is that the balance beams start to tilt in the positive direction. Not just in this abstract term, but it starts to reshape our body. It reshapes our physiology. It reshapes our brains. And this is, for example, just one data point to show how the balance beam actually shifts. In this chart, what you see is that the ACEs scores, or the Adverse Childhood Experience scores, in each column you see mental health challenges that are associated with higher and higher ACE scores. I marked in yellow crayons. You see that the light blue bar in each of the grouping, that is for people who have answered the adverse childhood experiences 4 times or more. So 4 yeses and more. So their scores are 4 and above. And you see that as adults, they have the highest risks for these mental health conditions. However, what happens if there are positive childhood experiences that are happening at the same time as these adverse childhood experiences? Well, so in this chart, in a separate study led by Dr. Christine Bethel, what you see there is that for those who have answered 4 or more in the adverse childhood experiences chart, if at the same time they're able to say yes to the positive childhood experiences. So the orange bar is they say yes 0 to 2 times. The green bar is when they can say yes to almost all 7 questions of the positive childhood experiences. And what happens to their risk factor for mental health? You see it tilts back down. That the positive experiences provides this protective factor, right? That even in the context of adverse experiences, help to tilt the balance beam towards positive development. And these questions are questions that every one of us, each one of us could identify. When we look back at our own development, when we look at the development of our own children, we can go through the questions and think about the times we can say yes. And much more importantly, we can think about the people who have helped us to say yes to these questions. And so, what does that mean in the context of building an early childhood system that enables children, enables families to say yes to these experiences? When we think about how the pandemic have disrupted our early childhood system, it left so much of the child caregiving and teaching responsibility with the families, and helpers for a time period felt cut off from the families and from their colleagues even. But as we gradually trying to rebuild, as we gradually try to adapt with the challenges, the helpers are connected with other helpers within their communities through virtual events like the virtual event we're in right now, that we have an opportunity to feel that we're with other people who share our passion and practice in early childhood. And for so many helpers around the world, even when they couldn't be there with the children, they reached out to the families. They reached out to offer support to let families know that early childhood educators and providers are partners to families first and foremost. And there are many efforts across the country that have enlarged the community of support to families, from community organizations, from home visiting, from early intervention, from pediatricians. All of that are part of the community of support for families, making them feel that even when we can't change the world around them right away, they're at least not alone in their struggles, and that there are others who are there to provide that support. And one of the most important things I think we learned from this pandemic that we should have learned a long, long time ago is something that two of my colleagues at the graduate school would say, that in order for the system to work, we have to help the helpers and help the families. That when it comes to investment, we need to be as invested in the helpers and the families as they are invested in our children. And what is true in common sense, as it is true in research, is that we cannot make a lasting impact on young children by skipping over the adults in the middle. And it couldn't be clearer during the last 2 years of the pandemic when it comes to families and when it comes to all those who work on the front lines of the early childhood system. That our system can only be good enough for children if they're good enough for the adults who are deeply invested in the children. And what that would mean is that we needed to build the kind of system that looks like this, that invests in the adults, invests in the supports, the compensations, and the recognitions of the adults' needs and of the adults' expertise. And it's only then that these adults can give themselves fully to the young children in their care, and that we can create communities for young children within that context. And for all of us who are gathered today celebrating the first Early Education Month, we have very different roles to play in this early childhood system. And I'd like to think of each of us, whether we're administrators, whether we're teachers, whether we're researchers, that each of us is like a center of a ripple. And our work and the way we relate to each other and the way we communicate our messages ripples out and touches the human beings and the human relationships throughout the system. And if we all collectively understand that our work is ultimately to strengthen the human connections all across our system in order to support the human beings, then we can really center our work on what we think is the essential question, no matter what it is we do, no matter where we are as the center of ripple, which is that how can our practices, our programs, our policies encourage, enrich, and empower the human relationship the human relationships around children, around families, and around their helpers. And if we can do that, if we can ask that question time and time again at every meeting, at every occasion which we have to make a decision, this is where we can build a good enough early childhood system for the children, for the families, and for all those who serve them. I thank you all to invite me to join your celebration, and I want to turn back to Dr. Sonia to moderate the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Li. What a joy it was to listen to you today. And one of the things I was writing down is, we have to help the helpers who help the families, and to just think of ourselves as in different ways as different ripple makers to make sure that families and children and the people that care for them get what they need. So thank you so much for that today. I know we have one comment. And it's thank you for explaining the positive childhood experiences. It's great to discover research on how positive childhood experience can help mitigate ACEs. So absolutely. And that leads to a question that I got via text while you were talking was, you talked about those positive experiences and how they can help offset ACEs. Can you give us some real life examples of how caregivers and educators help create these positive experiences so that they can see what they're doing on the day-to-day basis that they may not actually realize?
So I'll refer back to the second video that I showed, right? When you see these children, many of whom are children of first responders during a very, very difficult time in New York City. And you can imagine these responders, especially if they work in the hospitals, right? They wouldn't have that much time to be with their children. And if they're in the hospitals, they couldn't even be with their children when they come back. And so under that context, if we see it from the lens of that child, right, who are the adults that are available in that child's life, right, to be, for example, one of those at least two adults outside your family who took a genuine interest in you, right? So what help those children, right, to, if they were ever surveyed, to think about, who are these adults who have been in your life? What helped them to say yes are the teacher like that, someone who's there to attend to their play, to listen to their questions, right, to create space for them to think about what happens if my sister is sick. And I know that it's not always the case that a young child may be able to, quote unquote, remember it. But even as you're watching that video, I hope you can feel what it means to do the right thing here and now, right? To be there, to in that moment, to be that protective buffer. And if we were to talk to kind of pediatricians and medical scientists, what they would say is that what we see on the screen is that video, but what is happening on the inside is that the entire stress self-regulation system is being co-regulated through the connection of that interaction. And that shapes the physiology and the brain development of that child in that moment. And the more buffers a child have, the more the child is able to kind of be resilient through these different stressors that come. It doesn't have to rise even to the level of these adverse childhood experiences. Imagine how scared and worried a child might be knowing that, for example, that their parents are going to the hospital day in and day out during a difficult time like that. Or their parents are struggling. It doesn't have to be the hospital. Their parents are out there working as essential workers, when the child is able to understand that it's a dangerous thing to be out there. And so that kind of stress needed that relational space for the child to be able to work through. And that's what we saw in that tiny moment. And you can only imagine over the last 2 years how many of these tiny moments have happened throughout childcare and preschools all across the country.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that those tiny moments that children and families and caregivers are having are saving saving lives at the end of the day. We often talk about they're not, your children or my children, they're all our children. And so when we have that collective community that you talked about, we can see good, healthy outcomes for little people so that they can thrive and not just survive. We can't thank you enough for being with us today, Dr. Li, and sharing all your research and your wisdom and just quite frankly, your genuine care for young children. As someone who is an infant toddler specialist by training, I get big people who get little people. And so I really appreciate that about you. And I can't thank you enough, as well as Dr. Bromley today for joining us at today's keynotes. And thank you to everyone who really took time out of their busy schedules to join us for today's program and subsequent discussion. We're looking forward to a full month of virtual programming in recognition of Early Ed Month. Throughout the month, we are co-hosting regional events for elected officials and business leaders with United Ways across Louisiana, as well as Nicholls State University. Next Thursday, we invite you to participate as we celebrate Social Media Day of Action. We'll be sharing a social media toolkit with you all following today's events so that you can learn how to join the social media campaign. On Tuesday, February 15th at 6 p.m. Central, we invite you and all parents and guardians or anyone who wants to learn how to advocate for Louisiana's youngest learners to join us for our Louisiana Early Education Month Parent Advocacy Training event that we're doing with Stand for Children Louisiana. For details on how to tune into this month's programming and to learn more about early childhood education in Louisiana, please follow us on social media at Policy Institute LA or visit our website at policyinstitutela.org. Again, we can't thank you enough for helping us kick off Early Ed Month, the first of its kind that we've had in Louisiana. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the rest of the events this month.